and I've been deceived. Yeah, but haven't we all? I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. Well, I don't know why, and I don't know where, and I don't even know how, and I no longer care. But I've seen your face, and I've heard your call. Yes, I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. I've seen the sun hang like a flame in the sky. Yes, I've seen the sun turn, and I've seen the sun die. And I often think now, before our time is run, will there be any thoughts for what we have done? Well, I don't have much money, and I don't have much time, and I don't have many friends I could call mine.
Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A Season 8, Episode 3. My very special guest today is Dr. Denis Fortin, and it's great to have him on the show. Welcome. Can I call you Denis?
Yes, you may, and I'm very happy to be back with you here, Peter.
It's so good to have you here. I think this might be our third time we've chatted.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and maybe a fourth where you were on a panel with Matthew Cortman and
Yes.
Ron Graybill.
Yes, that's right.
That was
Yes.
fascinating too. I
Yes.
encourage anyone watching, go back and find those interviews.
Yes.
Yeah, so great to have you here. And we're going to be talking about your new book,
Yes.
which I'm just going to quickly bring up onto the screen to show everyone off the bat. By the way, we've got regular viewers, George Tichy here with us, and Old Faithful, he says, here again to watch another great show. Welcome, George. Arthur Klim, I'm not sure if you know Arthur at all.
Yes.
And he's watching. So, and we've got Mark Anthony, Rodney Smith. Now, Rodney, you behave yourself. Stop sidetracking my show. And we've got California Girl herself, Angela Lima. Great to have Angela here as well. Oh, and Gillian Ford is watching. Good to have Gillian here as well.
Good morning, Gillian.
So welcome, everybody. Here is Dr. Denis Fortin's new book. I can't make it larger than that, but I think people can see it. It's available.
Hey, I can put it on the screen.
Oh, yes. Look at that. Let me just put this back into off-screen mode so we can actually hold
There
that
we go.
up. That is so good. Now, it is reverse pictured, but that's all right. We can we've got LG Reltub. No, it's GI Butler. And the subtitle there is an honest but misunderstood church leader. And we were chatting off air that this particular individual was right there at ground zero with the 1888 conference, which was one of the huge landmark events of Adventism that rumbles in the halls of academia and also in real life conversations with people of all levels of Adventist kind of understanding. And I mentioned off air that I'm fascinated by it in a similar way to the Neil Wilson, Des Ford kind of era, and the Butler and Ellen White and Wagner and Jones in the 1888 era. It's just fascinating. And there's some similarities there we can chat about a little bit later.
We could, yes.
Now, I tried to buy this earlier. I'm just going to see if I can do it now. Oh, yeah, it's doing the same thing.
It's not quite, it's almost ready to be shipped, I think.
Right.
Yeah, it's coming close to being able to be shipped. I mean, the book's been in the warehouse for about a month.
And I think the Kindle version is available, but for some reason, I'm in the Australian Amazon and the US Amazon, and every time I go to buy it, it gets me to sign in a funny way. But anyway, I'm definitely going to grab that. And I've really enjoyed watching some of your video interviews you've done. What was the name of the one you did with Michael Campbell and his host? Can you share the host name again? I forget.
Michael Campbell and Greg Howell. They have a podcast on Adventist history with the North American division. And we recorded 3 episodes, and I think 2 of them have been released so far. The third one is coming out soon.
Right. Oh, good. And they're called, hang on, I've got it right in front of me because I was literally watching it this morning, Adventist History Podcast. Now, that's not to be confused, or is it the same as, is Matthew?
Yeah, Matthew Lucio is also part of the team.
Part of that, yeah.
Yes, the 3 of them.
I was giving that a big plug yesterday. So, yes, I didn't realize that the 3 of them were together on that.
Yes,
anyway,
they are.
Yeah, so that's a great podcast to go and check out as well.
Yeah.
And the other one I listened to was your one, they call it ATSS Presents, and that's the Adventist Today Sabbath School series.
Yes.
I just highly recommend people go and check that out as well. And you've done a few there. You've got one on lessons from the 1919 Bible Conference, and you've got the one there with the George Butler, an honest but misunderstood church leader. And those, I'll just hold up. People can, that's what they look like.
Yep. The Adventist Today Sabbath Seminar.
Yes, and if people are interested in this topic, those 2 podcasts where they interview Denis are incredible. I highly recommend them. So we've got a great audience watching. So I often just ramble at the start a little bit. Not that we're rambling about inconsequential things at all, but just gives a chance for the audience to build up. So we're ready to kick off. And just first of all, tell us a little bit about who you are. I know you're still a professor there at Andrews University, and it's great to have you on the program. So a little bit of background to you, and then we're going to kick off with a slideshow on this really interesting topic.
Well, good morning to you folks in Australia. Good evening to those of us in North America. And good night for those in Europe or Africa listening. It's good to be back with you here on this program with Peter. And thank you for the invitation, Peter, to be with you. You're noticing my accent.
Yes.
I am a French Canadian from Quebec City in Eastern Canada. I have been a Seventh-day Adventist pastor for many years, and here at Andrews University for 30 years. So it's been 3 decades here at Andrews.
Yeah.
I'm a professor of historical theology. I also teach or have done a lot of research in Adventist studies, Ellen White studies. I was the co-editor of the Ellen White Encyclopedia that came out about 10 years ago. And for the last 10 years now, I've been working on this project for the George Butler biography, part of the Adventist Pioneers series. I think this is book 19 or 20 of the series, and there's a good 10 others that are being prepared. So it's a beautiful series. We've learned a lot about Adventist pioneers, their context, their lives, their relationship with one another, and all the issues that they dealt with. So it's very good to be with you.
Yeah, great to have you here. How is my pronunciation when I say Denis Fortin?
Well, a little French lesson. It's Denis.
Denis.
It's Denis. Don't pronounce the S. Most of the French letters are not pronounced anyway. So it's Denis. Last name is Fortin.
Fortin. Denis Fortin. I want to practice that. I'm going to say it one more time, and I'm going to loop it later and just make sure I get it right, because I feel like I'm one of the closest of the people that interview.
Thank you, Denis. Denis and Fortin. Fortin is fine, but in French it's Fortin.
Yeah, I like it. I want to try and learn it properly. I think people's names are important, and I don't want to say, "Hey, we've got Denis Fortin here with us today."
Yeah, I know. I get that once in a while.
So tell us a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. And I think I heard you mention on one of the interviews I saw that George Knight is behind this kind of pioneer series.
Yes, he is. He is the general editor for the series. He's the one who started the series and has been, pushing for it for a good 20 years now, I think. And the first book to have been published were the biography of James White by Gerald Wheeler, which we hope a second edition could be prepared, an updated one. And then the second book, I think, if I remember well, was one by George Knight on Joseph Bates. And since then, there's been about 20. This is the latest one that just came out this month.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so share with us a little bit about George Butler. And
so what I'll share this evening, today, is basically the same PowerPoint presentation that I did for the Adventist Today's Sabbath seminar a month ago. And so that's the one I will share, and for this audience, because I would say most of you have not seen it, and it's a different context as well.
And also, I think we may have a chance to, in that presentation you mentioned a few other little topics that you said to them, and we won't be able to get to these today. And I thought, oh, good, maybe we can get to them in our chat so we can expand on the ATT presentation.
Okay, it's up to you. So
I'd love it. I would love it. Well, so do you want to do a little preamble or get straight into the slides?
Let's get right into it.
Okay, awesome.
So I will share my window.
Yes.
This one.
And there we go. And we'll keep us to the side there, and hopefully everyone can see everything. I know there's a couple of little things blocking, but we'll get the idea. It's very.
We'll get the I think so. Yeah. I think we'll be okay. So
yeah.
So here we go. Let's see here. I may have to do this window for myself, and so here we go. There have not been a lot of biographies or a lot of writings about George Butler. Butler was a GC president, General Conference president, for a couple terms in the 1800s. He's not been very well known. In 1979, Emmett Van de Veer wrote a small book of about 130 pages on George Butler, and he titled it A Rugged Heart. And that was 1979. And at the time, there were not a lot of the writings of George Butler that were available. The databases were not electronic. One had to do library research, archive research to try to find some of the documents. So he was very limited in the amount of material he had to write a biography. The biography I wrote is of the text itself is 620 pages, so it is 5 times as voluminous as the one that Vanderveer wrote in 79. So what I'll share with you tonight is a little bit of a biography of Butler in the first half, and then I will highlight 3 momentous, 3 big moments perhaps of the life of George Butler that might be interesting among many other points of interest. And we'll go from there as far as conversation. Butler was born in 1834 in this little house in Waterbury, Vermont, one of the eastern states of the United States in the northeastern New England part of the United States. He was born the grandson of his grandfather, Ezra Butler, a pioneer settler of the state of Vermont in the town of Waterbury. Grandfather Butler was himself a Baptist minister, but also quite active in government at the time in the state of Vermont, representative in the U.S. Congress for a couple years during the War of 1812, and then also governor of Vermont for 2 one-year terms in the 1820s. So very active in public life. His son, however, who is the father of George Butler, is Ezra Pitt Butler, married to Sarah Grow Butler. Although Baptist and also quite devoted to his Baptist faith, Ezra Pitt Butler did not go into public service like his father did. Was simply a businessman in Waterbury, Vermont, where he raised his family. As a Baptist also, he was active in his local church, and in the 1840s became a very devoted follower of William Miller and the Millerite movement. So as everyone else in the Millerite movement, they were very disappointed after October 22, 1844. And that becomes important in the story of George Butler and the Butler family. Butler himself, George Butler, is one of 10 children that Ezra and his wife Sarah will have. So George is toward the end, is the eighth of the the eighth of the 10 children, and of those children, 3, the ones highlighted here in purple, will die in youth, infancy, or in youth. The other ones all grew up to be adults, and almost all of them became Seventh-day Adventist, except for the other brother of George Butler, who is William Butler, never made a profession of becoming a Seventh-day Adventist. But the others did. All of the others, all of his sisters became Seventh-day Adventist. We've got a few photos of the family. Here are 4 of the Butler sisters. You got from left to right, you've got Aurora Butler Lockwood, and then 2 twins that are standing, Martha Adelia Butler, who married William Andrews, and after he died, she married Augustine Bordeaux. And then Mary Amelia Butler Washburn, an important name in the 1920s in Adventism, the Washburn name. And then another sister, the oldest of the sister, is Sarah Butler Whipple, wife of a businessman in Battle Creek. George Butler marries Lantha Ames Lockwood. In 1859, they would be married for 42 years, so a very long time. Lantha is 8 years older than George. They were kind of neighbors in Vermont, living approximately 2 small villages away from each other, but they knew each other from the Millerite movement, the early Sabbatarian Adventist movement. The 2 families, the Lockwoods and the Butlers, were intimate. They knew each other. And that is how a relationship began between the 2 of them. One thing that could be said, if I go back to the prior photo here, Aurora Butler Lockwood, she married Ransom Lockwood, who is the brother to Lantha Lockwood. So you've got 2 Butlers who married 2 Lockwoods of the same family. The George and Lantha will have 3 children. Anna or Annie, who died in 1874 at about the age of 13, 14, 15, thereabout. And then they have 2 fraternal twins, William and Helen Butler. So 3 children, and only the 2 young boys will grow up to be adults. The little girl will die as a young teenager. Butler is a churchman and a leader par excellence. By the time he died in 1918, George Butler was probably one of the most experienced church leader in Adventism at about that time. Now, by then, some others were beginning to challenge that title, but he was a very important church leader in early Adventism. Was conference president of 4 conferences: the Iowa Conference in the 1860s all the way to the 1880s, and then Missouri Conference, and then even the Michigan Conference for 2 years. He served 2 terms, or 2 lengths of times, as president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists from December 71 until August of 74 as a first period of time. Please note also that about during the same time, he is also president of Iowa and president of Iowa, Nebraska. And during the second period of time, he is president of the General Conference between 1880 until 1888. And if you pay attention there also at the dates, you will see that while he is GC president, he is also for some time president of the Iowa Conference, president of the Missouri Conference, and president of the Michigan Conference. And not only is he president of all these institutions, but he's also president of multiple boards, which is the responsibility of the GC president in those years. President of the Review and Herald Publishing Association, Battle Creek College, and a number of other activities. Is it possible for a human being to be having so many administrative responsibilities within a small denomination and really keep his sanity? I say no. And in the book, in the biography, I tell you why that did not work. Butler had a problem with delegation. Perhaps he felt that he was a one-man show, could solve all the problems, that he had perhaps all the best wisdom in the world to be able to solve the difficulties of the conferences, and maybe nobody else could do it. Only him could do it well. Well, after a while, that does not work. And Butler suffered a progressive, severe burnout between 1886 to 1888. As the church grew, as it had more people, more conferences, more other parallel institutions like publishing houses, sanitariums, and so on, really, he began to be so overextended in his responsibility with overwork, little rest, constant pressures to make decisions and to solve problems because he is the point person, hundreds of letters to respond to, incessant travel away from home, poor accommodation, poor food. And then, of course, toward these years, 1886 to 1888, you've got also the crises over the law in Galatians and Ellen White's severe rebukes of him and his kinds of leadership during about the same period of time. So you've got all of these pressures mounting on him, and there is no wonder that he suffered from this progressive burnout for a period of about 3 years until he collapsed basically in 1888. He resigned from all offices in absentia in October of 1888. He stayed in Battle Creek, did not go to the Minneapolis General Conference session, sent letters and telegrams telling people, do not vote me into office. He cannot do it anymore. A doctor had predicted that if he did not retire that month of October, November 1888, he would die from his burnout. A little later, some years later, when he reflected upon what happened in those last couple years in office, he mentioned in a couple letters that he had fever of 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, I don't know what it is in Celsius, but it's pretty high. I think the human body is what, 37, 38 Celsius?
Yes.
And that's about 96 Fahrenheit, 97 Fahrenheit. So he had 105 Fahrenheit. That's really high. And he had constant headaches and constant fever while still trying to be General Conference president. So in December of 1889, he received an invitation from somebody he did not know in Florida to go to live with them for a few months to recuperate from his burnout. He accepted the invitation. And so him and his wife, Lantha, left Battle Creek in mid-December 1888, right after the end of the GC session in Minneapolis, and then moved to Florida. And he would stay there for the next many, many years. In fact, he died in Bowling Green, Florida, where he moved in 1888. A few months later, he bought a piece of land, built a house, began to cultivate his garden and an orange orchard as well. Things would have been good, and he began to recuperate from his burnout, but another tragedy hit the home. In March of 1890, so about 14 months after moving to Florida, Lantha was paralyzed for the rest of her life by a stroke of paralysis, a severe stroke that paralyzed half of her body. George remained a faithful husband devoted to her for all of those years. Lantha could not walk. She could speak, but hard to understand her. She could not use half of her limbs, hand and also legs. And for that very long period of time, for over 11 years, George faithfully cared for her as the caretaker until she died at the age of 76 in November of 1901. Strangely, but he had already said it a few times, that once or if his wife were to depart, they didn't have the kind of medicine in those days that we do have today to take care of a stroke, that when she would go, if he were able to, he would go back to church leadership. Well, that kind of small talk did not fall on deaf ears, and within a month of Lantha's death in November of 1901, within a month, within a couple of weeks, in fact, he was voted as president of the Florida Conference, which he kept for 4 years. Yes, about 4 years, 3 years. 3 years, excuse me. And then 2 months later, in January of 1902, he became the president of the Southern Union Conference. The Union Conferences had just been established a year earlier, and he becomes the president of that Union Conference in the southern part of the United States. Florida is included in that, and he will be president of that union for 6 years, so 3 two-year terms. When he finally retires in January of 1908, he is 73 years old. So a very active man, even after, the death of his wife. But by the time he retires in January of 1908, he is tired. He has been saying for about a year and a half, that he needed to be replaced. Too much stress for his age, and also beginning perhaps to feel a little bit of a burnout coming back again. And he does not want to have another one. So he is replaced in 1908. Between 1889, so when he retires as GC president, until 1901, those 10, 12 years, while he is supposedly retired in Florida taking care of his wife, he wrote more than 200 devotional articles for church papers. And then he wrote another 80 after his final retirement in 1908. Altogether, I have counted, and I'm sure I have missed many of them. But during his entire ministry, he wrote 5 books and well over 500 devotional articles for Adventist papers. The Review, the Signs, the Watchman for the Southern Union Conference, and so on. That's a lot of writing. And then added to that is a huge correspondence. We still have well over 700 letters that he wrote during his lifetime. That's a lot of letters, and most of them are well over 10 pages long, and many of them are handwritten. So I learned while doing the biography how to read George Butler, and it took me a while, but after a while I was able to decipher his handwriting. It was quite a task. And then what is amazing also, and I devote 2 chapters to this in the biography, is the 150 letters that Butler and Dr. Kellogg exchanged during the tumultuous years of the pantheism crises after 1902 until Kellogg left the denomination and took with him the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1906. The two of them exchanged 150 letters during that period of time. An amazing correspondence that I think reveals some aspects of these 2 controversies, the pantheism one, and then the leaving the denomination, and the Battle Creek Sanitarium leaving the denomination, some insights that nobody has really, discussed or tried to understand from Butler's perspective and from Kellogg's perspective. I hope these 2 chapters are going to shed a lot of light on these 2 crises, but also help people, hopefully, to delve into this correspondence even more. I would see 1 or 2 good doctoral dissertations. There were MA theses being written by students just on those topics. It's amazing. But let's continue.
That's fascinating.
Oh, it is fascinating. So Lentha Butler dies in 1901, in November of 1901. Butler becomes a widower. And in 1907, he remarries. Now, you will read in the biography that there is an attempt at marrying someone else about a year or 2 after Lentha died. I will not go into it here for sake of time here today, but you will find also that quite fascinating in the biography, what happens there with this young lady. But in 1907, he marries a widow by the name of Elizabeth Jane Work Granger, the widow of William Granger, who had been the principal of Hillsburg College or Hillsburg Academy there in California. William Granger dies while he is a missionary in Japan. His widow, Elizabeth, comes back to live near Santa Helena and Hillsburg College there in California. Butler gets acquainted to her while he does a visit to California. They begin to correspond for about a year or so, exchanging letters. And then there is a surprise wedding in October of 1907 at the home of his nephew, Charles Washburn, in Nashville, Tennessee, where Butler is the Union president. They will be married until George Butler dies in 1918, so about 11 years. And she will die in 1927 at the home of her daughter in California. So it's a beautiful marriage, even though it's an older person's marriage. It's a beautiful marriage. They both get along quite well. They speak very well of each other. The letters we have of both of them during their marriage years speak very well of one another. So it was a good match, even though it was a correspondence kind of match. It worked, as far as we can tell.
And did you say she was older than him as well?
No, he is older than her.
Oh, right. His
He
first
is old.
wife. So,
His first wife is 9 years older than him,
yes.
and the second wife is 9 years younger than
Than
him.
him.
Yeah, so there's 9 years in both directions with the
Yes.
two women in his life. Here are the last few photos we have of George Butler. 1915 at the Loma Linda, California camp meeting, and also there's a GC session, I think, that happens in those years in California. That might be when he gets acquainted with Elizabeth Jane Granger. So here's one with Stephen Haskell, John Loughborough standing in the middle, and George Butler sitting. You may wonder, why is one standing, the other two sitting? It's because the one standing is very, very short.
Right. Loughborough was quite short, was he?
Yeah, Loughborough is a short man, a tiny little man. And so if the other two had been standing, he would be below their shoulders.
Right.
So that's probably why it is. Here's another one, 1917 of Butler. And that we know, this is the last one. This is the last photo of Butler taken at his home in Bowling Green, Florida. And that might be the house there behind them during a visit of Stephen and Hetty Haskell. The Haskells remained very good friends of the Butlers until he died. Butler is buried right beside his wife in the Bowling Green Cemetery in Florida, and this is his tombstone. At the very bottom of the tombstone there, it is written, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith." That's a very interesting statement. A lot of people have kind of surmised that Butler was not that strong of an Adventist, that after he retired from the GC session, he apostatized. All kinds of rumors were circulated about him, that he was not a faithful Adventist. If Butler decided to have this text put on his tombstone, and I don't know for sure if it is him or his children who put that on the tombstone, it is very telling, because that is the way he would have thought about himself. He was a devoted Christian believer in Jesus and loved the Lord, and to the best of his abilities wanted to do the Lord's will in his life and also in his activities as a church leader. So these are broad strokes of the life of George Butler. What I'd like to do for a few more minutes is to go over 3 momentous epochal moments of Butler's life. Now, there are many. There are many moments, and the biography goes through many of them. But let me talk about 3. 3 that are perhaps the most relevant to our knowledge of Adventist history and Adventist conflicts and our general knowledge, although a whole lot more could be said. Let's start with the Waukon clan. What is this about? Waukon is a little town in Iowa in the 1850s. It's been settled just a few years before. In 1855 and in 1856, many New England families, Adventist and non-Adventist, emigrated toward Iowa or beyond the Mississippi River, or even western Illinois, on the east side of the Mississippi River. And you have here a number of Adventist families or Sabbatarian Adventist families emigrating to Waukon, this little town in the northeastern corner of Iowa, at the same time as the white family migrates to Battle Creek, Michigan, and moves the Review and Herald Press to Battle Creek, Michigan. So what you have here happening is a social dynamics immediately creating two centers of influence in this young, unorganized, small denomination of Sabbatarian Adventists. One in Waukon and one in Battle Creek. What's happening in Waukon? Well, in Waukon, you've got a number of big, influential families that have decided to move from Vermont and from the state of Maine to Iowa. You've got the John Andrews family, you've got Uriah Smith, and you've got the Butler family. But not only do you have these families and also the Stevens at the same time, but you've got something else happening here, is that these four families intermarry. So here's what happens. The two ladies on this photo here. So you've got John Andrews married to Angeline Stevens, and in the middle, you got Uriah Smith married to Harriet Stevens. They are both daughters of Cyprian Stevens, also from the state of Maine. So the two Stevens sisters are marrying John Andrews and Uriah Smith. Now, Butler gets connected with all of that because at the same time, you've got John Andrews' brother, William, who marries Martha Butler, George Butler's younger twin sister. And then years later, you've got a little bit of all of this continuing in some other kind of fashion, is that you've got Hilland Butler, who's the son of George Butler, who will marry Clara Kellogg, who's the younger sister of John Harvey Kellogg. So Butler and Kellogg's, the Butlers and the Kellogg's, are now also interrelated by marriage.
Oh, wow.
And even more to this is that when William Andrews dies, his widow, Martha Butler, will marry Augustin Bourdeau. So what you have happening here is that you've got a clan that is being formed, and the clan is all around these interrelated marriages that are happening between these fairly influential families in the Sabbatarian Young Seventh-day Adventist denomination. And it creates a powerful base of influence that will be in near constant tension in the 1860s and the 1870s. Wow. With a very strong-willed and somewhat dictatorial James White, and then also with his wife, Ellen White. Already two biographies, the one by Gary Land of Uriah Smith and the one by Gail Valentine of J.N. Andrews, have demonstrated these kinds of intermarried relationships. And if something happened between James White and one person in this clan, well, the whole clan became against James White in some fashion. And the tension continued, and the tension propagated to the other members of the clan. And that's fascinating.
Amazing.
It's amazing what's happening. And perhaps that helps us understand some of the tensions that are happening between these various church leaders at the time. A plug for my book. Read the book. You'll find out more.
Yes. Can I just ask a quick question there?
You may.
Butler took on after James White, though, didn't he? So there must have been, while there was a huge amount of tension between the two clans, there must have been some respect as well, or they would have tried to maneuver Butler away from that position.
Well, there is that too, and it will happen. You're right. The tensions between George Butler and James White are going to become very dramatic in Adventism in the 1870s, a little bit during the first term of office that Butler has as GC president, but also in the second term of office, there is 1 year of overlap before James White dies. So Butler becomes GC president, James White is still alive, And there is a 1 year there before James White dies where the tension builds up again.
Right.
And it's pretty dramatic.
I'm
during that.
dying to ask, and we'll leave it for later, but I'm fascinated to know how Ellen White used the spirit of prophecy to help control the Waukon clan. But we'll come to that.
Well, okay. Well, yeah, sure. That's certainly part of the issues that are
Yeah.
happening there too. Yes.
Mm.
Okay. Well, second epochal momentous moment of Butler's life, and it is the conflict over the law in Galatians in the 1880s.
Mm.
To understand that carefully and to really understand George Butler's position, we have to understand why Ezra Pitt Butler, George Butler's father, became a Seventh-day Adventist. And it happens in 1849 or 1850 when Joseph Bates, the man on the left, visited the Butler home in Waterbury, Vermont. Joseph Bates, when he visited the Butler home, convinced Sarah Butler of becoming a Sabbatarian Adventist. And about a year later, Ezra Pitt Butler also becomes a Seventh-day or Sabbatarian Adventist in those years. How did a Baptist Millerite believer who does not believe in obedience to the law in order to be saved become a Sabbatarian Adventist? What did Joseph Bates say to Sarah Butler and then to Ezra Pitt Butler to convince them to become Sabbatarian Adventists? They're Baptists, and that's big. It's a big issue. Well, here is what he did. Bates convinced Ezra Pitt Butler to accept the Sabbatarian Adventist when he explained that there is a strict distinction to be made between the eternal and immutable law of God, the Ten Commandments, written on 2 tables of stone and placed inside the Ark of the Covenant in the wilderness tabernacle, in contrast to all of the other ceremonial laws of temporal nature that were written on a parchment by Moses and placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. This argument that Bates used to convince the Butlers to become Sabbatarian Adventists is crucial to understand why George Butler, 30-some years later, will oppose E.J. Waggoner and A.T. Jones in their understanding of the law in Galatians. This is crucial here. It is a huge theological and interpretational tidbits of information here that most of the time we simply scan or not even mention. So here's what's happening. In Galatians 3, verses 19, 24, 25, the Bible says, Paul asks a rhetorical question. Why then is there the law? And then he explains. The law was added because of transgression. Added because of transgressions. And it would be there until the offspring should come to whom the promise has been made. Well, that's Jesus, isn't it? And it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Well, the Ten Commandments were written by God, not by an angel and not by an intermediary. So that must refer to the ceremonial law. And then, of course, it is a guardian until Christ came. So meaning that when Jesus came, basically this law is no longer needed as a guardian. So Bates used that kind of an interpretation of Galatians 3 to say that this law is not the Ten Commandments, it is a ceremonial law. So therefore, when we read other passages like Colossians 2, where it talks about questions of food, drink, festival, new moon, and a Sabbath, these are a shadow of things to come. Oh, well, those are the ceremonial things of the Old Testament. They have nothing to do with the eternal, immutable Ten Commandments of God, written by God himself and placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. You see, that is a crucial understanding, an apologetic understanding that early Sabbatarian Adventists used to promote the observation of the Sabbath at the end of time, and by making this clear distinction between the two laws. Well, in 1886, E.J. Wagoner begins to teach that the interpretation of the law in Galatians 3 is referring to the Ten Commandments. And for Butler, that's just like having a heart attack. To him, it fundamentally undermined Butler's understanding of the Adventist message that his parents had accepted from Joseph Bates. And for Butler, the crucial distinction between the immutable law of God, the Ten Commandments, and the ceremonial laws is done away with by E.J. Wagoner. And Butler would have none of it. Butler said, no way, that can't happen. And of course, he's not alone. You've got Uriah Smith, and you've got many other conference presidents and other pastors who are just as vehemently opposed to what E.J. Wagoner is trying to say, to try to explain justification by faith, that we don't need to obey the law in order to be forgiven. But Butler does not understand it this way. Following the example he had received from James White, that he is in charge of the church, he believes that he is the leading overseer of doctrinal orthodoxy into the church, so he takes it on personally as being his own crusade, so to speak, to defend the established view by the majority of Sabbatarian Adventists that the added law in Galatians is not the Ten Commandments. And so for him to yield on this point is basically to give up the foundations of Adventism, the old landmarks.
Can I ask a little question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. And again, just a little aside. Do you think that James White, if he'd made it to 1888 at the conference, do you think he would have been more likely to have sided with Butler and been rather strictly opposed to Wagner and Jones?
I think so, and I think George Butler believes that.
Yes.
And I will add one more. I will say that if John Andrews had been alive in 1888, he would also have sided with Butler.
Yes. And that opens up this whole other fascinating vagueness of Ellen White's support of Wagner and Jones, while also, but we'll come to that later, while also defending the Butler view
in some ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
there's
really
conflictual.
Yes.
There's conflictual signals being passed on there.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, she basically agrees with Butler, but also wants to allow Jones and Wagoner to go ahead and preach their message. And Butler will not accept this kind of theological diversity, pluralism. Butler will not go for that.
And I wonder, and again, this is later, I'm just saying it now so we can pin these thoughts.
Yeah.
I wonder if it was ever resolved after 1888.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Yes.
We'll come back to that. Since a lot of people are visual, look at this picture. This is a picture commissioned by James White, created by an artist in 1876. What stands out when you look at this picture? What's the first thing your eyes are drawn to?
The tree.
It's the tree in the middle, isn't it? And on which hang the two tables of the Ten Commandments. The cross of Jesus is smaller than the Ten Commandments.
And off to the side.
The Old Testament typology there, the casting out of Eden, the death of Cain and Abel, and the sanctuary service is bigger than Jesus. And so this is how Butler understands, the plan of salvation. Obedience to the Ten Commandments is very crucial. Yes, Jesus died for us. Baptism, Lord's Supper commemorate what Jesus has done for us. But we need to obey the Ten Commandments to go from paradise lost to paradise restored. That's crucial for him. By around 1881, about 6 months or so before he dies, James White begins to have second thoughts about this picture. So it's about 4 years later, he has second thoughts. And in a letter to Ellen White in March, April 1881, he says to her that he's thinking of redoing this lithograph, to change it, to make Jesus more prominent. But he dies, and Ellen White and her sons pick up where James White left. And in 1883, so 2 years after James White dies, this is the picture that Ellen White publishes.
Oh, wow. Yes. Wow. Very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
The law tree is gone. No more Ten Commandments. There's a vague allusion to the Ten Commandments in the far right corner, far left corner at the top, where you see a mountain and
yes.
lightning bolt there. So Mount Sinai.
Wow.
But it's very, very secondary. It's not primary. Jesus is very big. And the shadow of Jesus is over the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is very small. The implications of the two pictures here is drastic in Adventist theology.
Yes, yeah.
You got an Adventist understanding of salvation here that is very obedience-oriented, Old Testament-based, sanctuary-based, based upon obedience to some extent. And here, you've got an understanding of salvation that is very Christ-focused, cross-focused, the death on the cross, and everything else is secondary. So not only is this going to have an impact upon, the rest of the decade, 1880s, but in the long term, it is going to have a lot of implication between what kind of Adventist theology are we going to have. One that is based on obedience and sanctification, or one that is based on the death of cross and the forgiveness of our sins and justification. Which of the two are we going to have? And you know what? Not quite all totally resolved today. Conflict is still going on in Adventism. So yes, epochal moment, and that's part of why George Butler would have such a burnout. He's very, very conflicted. George Butler, let's not forget, is a Baptist at heart. He believes in Jesus forgiving sins and Jesus being our Savior, the need of conversion and giving our hearts to Jesus. He is a Baptist who's become a Seventh-day Adventist. He knows his Bible and he's very keen about it. Yet at the same time, he believes in obedience to God, and that's important to him. And the law of God should not be cast aside in some ways. And so that is part of the big conflicts that we see happening in the 1880s. I tried to tell the story from Butler's perspective, of course. I think that's what matters here. Let's do one more. One third epochal moments of Butler's life, one last one, and it is the complexity of a relationship with Ellen White. It is complex. Butler and James and Ellen White had at times a difficult relationship, and for a number of reasons. The reason perhaps are multifaceted, and let me explain just a few of them. I go through the complexity of this relationship in many of the chapters in the book, all the way even to the end of the book, because that's really part of George Butler's life. When George Butler became president for the first time in 1871, at the end of 71, he took the presidency very, very reluctantly. In fact, for about a month and a half, he refused the presidency. By then, James White had had 3 strokes. He was exhausted. He needed some help. And one of the best persons probably to help at the time was George Butler, among a few, but certainly George Butler would be a good help. And so reluctantly, he accepted to become General Conference president. But at the same time, White refused to let go of his micromanaging of many of the day-to-day activities of the church. Butler knew that. Butler sensed that. And Butler knew that he would be a temporary replacement until James felt better. But to make things more complicated is that Ellen White had said repeatedly that James was the divinely chosen leader of the denomination. Nobody else could really take his place. Butler understood that, and because he believed that, he was therefore hesitant, cautious, very undecided in making many decisions that the General Conference president in those years needed to make on a week-to-week basis. And he constantly wrote letters to James White, asking for his opinion as to what he should decide as GC president. Well, that defeated the purpose in having somebody else than James be the General Conference president. That displeased James White tremendously. And in time, it also displeased Ellen White a great deal because Butler was so indecisive, so hesitant, so cautious, taking too much time in making too many decisions, and also at the same time refusing to move to Battle Creek for various reasons, mainly family reasons, refusing to go to Battle Creek. Well, in August of 74, James White returns to the presidency. And with a sigh of relief, George Butler gladly returns to Iowa. And also with a sigh of relief, James White goes back to the office. He's tired of having George Butler being the president. That's in August of 74. In January of 75, Ellen White wrote a scathing testimony to Butler, rebuking him about his lack of leadership, inefficient leadership, regarding his administration of the General Conference during those 2.5 years, and publishes the testimony in the testimonies that came out in February of 1875, without even giving any time to George Butler to respond to the testimony. It's a public rebuke, shaming to some extent here. Butler felt totally, utterly humiliated by that the 2 leaders of the church, James and Ellen White, would rebuke him publicly so severely as being so inefficient. And it troubled Butler so much that he completely severed his relationship with James and Ellen White for about 3 years. Refused to be anywhere they would be close. He refused. He lives in Iowa. He refused to attend the Iowa camp meeting in 1875 because James and Ellen White were going to be there. He went somewhere else just to do evangelism instead. He could not be in their presence because of the humiliation he had felt, but also because he basically felt that he was so incompetent that why should he support, James and Ellen White in their ministry since he's not able to do anything good anyway? And that complicates things, doesn't it? And this feeling of public shaming is something that happened also with a number of the other church leaders, and the other biographies have made mention of that. Uriah Smith, J.N. Andrews, and there were others as well. So what becomes complicated is that while George Butler accepted Ellen White's gift of prophecy and role within the church, now George Butler never doubted that Ellen White had the gift of prophecy and had a role to play within the remnant church. Never doubted that. But it's complicated to live with a real human being and to know a real human being on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis. He never understood her as being infallible beyond the possibility of making mistakes or of misunderstanding or misinterpreting events, situations, and people's motives. He knew well inside his own heart and mind that she had made mistakes in interpreting some events and in ascribing to him and to some others motives that were not their motives. And he could not understand that. He could not relate to that. So instead of condemning Ellen White publicly, rebuking her, or saying she's wrong here, she's wrong there, he would just keep it to himself and basically efface himself, just go away and not be a burden in some ways. Now, what happens in 75 happened again 3 more times in the life of Butler in the relationship with Ellen White. In 1886 to 1888, in the debates over the law in Galatians and the relationships between Butler and Smith with Jones and Wagoner, and also with Willie White and Ellen White in all of this. There's a number of letters that are exchanged between all of them, and George Butler comes to the conclusion that Ellen White is misguided. She is misinterpreting what is happening, and perhaps even a little clueless as to what is happening with this interpretation of the law in Galatians that Wagoner is promoting. That really upsets him, and that's part of the burnout that is happening in those 3 years. The same thing will happen in 1889. So a few months after he leaves Battle Creek to go to Florida, there's a little bit of exchange of letters between them. And he gets frustrated with Ellen White again because she ascribes to him motives that he believes he does not have. And that will be expanded a little bit more in the 1890s. In the early years that Ellen White is in Australia, the two of them will dialogue a little bit about what happened at the end of 88, beginning of 89, and this misunderstanding, this third misunderstanding flares up again around 1892, 93. And so again, misunderstanding, and for a period of time, they just are not going to write to each other. And then the last one happens just a few months before George Butler leaves the presidency of the Southern Union Conference. There's a disagreement about his administration of the Union office in Nashville, Tennessee. Ellen White writes a couple letters about what is happening in that office. Now, we need to understand that her son, Edson White, is also part of the office, and she sides with him in some of the conflicts that are happening over how to spend some money there. And Butler is really, really frustrated with the fact that he believes Ellen White is not understanding what is happening in the office in Nashville. And that will, again, be another moment of tension between the two of them, and they will just be apart and not talk to each other for a few years. It's difficult to work with a living human prophet. And I think George Butler shows that quite well in these various episodes of his life, which I hope I tried to explain as best as possible, to be fair to both George Butler but also to Ellen White in the conversation there in the book. In 1907, I'm almost done. In 1907, Ellen White's nephew, Frank Belden, corresponded with Butler about Butler's understanding of the role of her writings within the denomination. And in one of those letters, there's a few of them that are exchanged between the two of them. In one of those letters that he received from Butler, Belden added a handwritten comment. Now, you can see that only if you've got the original. and are able just to look at the piece of paper. And at the bottom of the letter, after George Butler signed, there's a handwritten note that says, Butler told me when I asked him why he was leaving Battle Creek in December of 1888 for Florida, he said, because I cannot agree with your Aunt Ellen. This is it right here. This is the handwritten note at the bottom of that letter of April 17, 1907. A comment that Belden wrote about this verbal conversation there. So there are tensions between Ellen White and George Butler. And in 1888, 1889, the tensions are real between the two of them. I'll stop there. There are many other fascinating episodes of George Butler's long life that you will find interesting and also intriguing if you read the biography. Let me mention a few of them. A few chapters on Butler's philosophy of leadership in support of James White's authoritarian style. That is a fascinating episode of how to understand GC leadership, the personality of James White. Another one is Butler's theology of inspiration in relationship to Ellen White's less than perfect prophetic ministry. In the 1880s, Butler will write a couple series of articles on the gift of inspiration or the doctrine of inspiration. That is also a fascinating aspect. As I've mentioned earlier, the correspondence between Butler and Kellogg is a fascinating episode of that history. And there are some insights there that have not been published before, and I hope this is fascinating to people. And then finally, one more. I cannot avoid mention or neglect, I should say, mentioning this one. When he was president of the Southern Union Conference, Butler had a huge influence on the development of Black institutions in the South, especially what we have today, Oakwood University. If it were not for Butler, I don't know that Oakwood University would exist today. And so we owe him a great deal of influence and also a great deal of respect and praise to some extent for how he protected Black institutions that were really, really having a hard time to survive in the early 1900s. I hope you'll find that also fascinating in the discussion there in the book. That's it.
Well,
let's talk.
That is amazing. And, you know, I think we've just scratched the surface there. I have got a lot of questions that have sprung from that, which I've been making little notes. And I'm very interested if people would like to ask you some direct questions about Butler. Not any side tangents, but if they are related to Butler and the thoughts that people watching have on 1888 and all the other stuff, we're going to have a 5-minute break. We often do at this point, and then we will come back and we will look at questions. So those of you that are watching, now's the time. What a great opportunity to have with Dr. Denis Fortin. I'm going to get that right one day. On the program today. It's just so fantastic. So what an opportunity to ask a question live in real time. So I'd love you to consider that, and then we'll pick up from a couple of questions that I've got. Some I've seen already. You may have seen some as well. And,
I'm looking at the chat right now. There's a lot of questions.
Yes. We've got a very healthy audience here from a wide and diverse range of people. So
how many people are watching at the moment?
We've got 5 platforms going, so I'd have to add all 5 of them up.
Oh, okay. That's all right then.
Yeah, there's a roughly 200 on all the platforms.
Okay.
And there'll be more than that when I get to see the other platforms as well. Okay. I get all the stats after. But we've got a very healthy audience, and I'm looking forward to to coming back in 5 minutes and looking at some of
Okay.
these questions. So you
Okay.
have a look as well, or have a break.
Yeah, I'll have a break.
And
Yeah.
those watching, please use this opportunity to write some questions down. Look forward to it. See you in 5 minutes.
You love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, and all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again. love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, and all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Oh, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hello and welcome back. My special guest today is Dr. Denis Fortin. And we're having a fantastic conversation. We always have a break in the middle of our program now. And so welcome back to the second half of today's presentation. People have written to me and said, where can they get my music? You can go there and support my content for free if you go and listen to it on Spotify. You just need to scan that code or look up Standing at the Cross Peter Dixon Band. It's Dixon, and there's a few Peter Dixon bands out there, or Peter Dixon. So Peter Dixon Band, and you can listen to it for free. And also just a quick plug for the channel. If people would like to support throwing me enough for a coffee or towards the program, the QR code is there. And I just want to thank Stephen Beagles, who is watching today, and I'll give him a quick plug on his own channel. Where is it? I'll just bring it up. He's got this program called the Adventist Gospel Network, and which he helped me set up, where we have links to people that are enjoying the kind of more progressive Adventist viewpoint. And Stephen, if you just send me a message, what's your own personal site? I'll give that a plug too. And the reason I raised Stephen there is he's helped make an SDAQ&A kind of website. No, we've just set it up as a very basic level, and I'm about to pull the plug, if I can, pull the trigger on getting a more professional hosting kind of service. If I can somehow raise about $150 to $200 by the end of the week, I'm going to go ahead with that. And I've already pretty much done a lot of the work creating the site, but I'm just needing that much to pay for a year's hosting. So if people are able to scan that code and support what I'm doing, that will all go towards having an SDAQ&A website with a proper SDAQA.com, and that will help to really get the program out there so people can enjoy amazing content like we are having today. So I'll start with just a couple of thoughts that I had on the presentation there, and then we'll go to some of the questions on the side and any that you've seen as well. And also, I was successful in the break to download the book.
Oh,
it finally worked for me.
okay.
Anyway, yeah. So
Good.
it's the G.I. Butler, An Honest but Misunderstood Church Leader. I'm just going to bring that up on the screen as well. I really encourage people to go to Amazon there. You can get the Kindle, and I think if you put an order in for the book, so there's my thanks, Peter Dixon, for purchasing. Where's the actual picture of the book? Must be back a page.
Yeah.
It's not coming up. There's some other interesting books that they have there. Other people also bought. We've got The Child of the Apocalypse there by Donald Casebolt, and also his book Father Miller's Daughter. Have you read those?
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't read them yet. I've actually bought one of them. I haven't read it yet.
Yep.
We've also got there the 1919 conference, 1922, Michael W. Campbell, who is on the show next week, everyone. He'll be on next week. So
very good.
Yeah, got Jerry Gladson's book there. And so I share that to let people know there's some incredible books out there. And yours is part of that Pioneer series that George Knight kind of kicked off. Are you in regular correspondence with him out of interest?
Yes, I am.
So maybe you can put a good word. I interviewed him in season 2. It'd be great to have him back and talk about this series, because I think I'd love to help promote that a little bit more and get it out there. So maybe we could have you and him and Gil Valentine on the show together talking about the series.
Yeah, we could. We could. Yeah.
So, right. So a couple of the thoughts I had. I just was furiously writing away. Just bringing them up here. And then we'll go to the questions on the side. It's one thing that, we drew this parallel to Glacier View, and the equivalent of perhaps Neil Wilson and George Butler, Des Ford, Wagner and Jones. Ellen White is kind of in the background of both of those episodes, even though she was not physically on the planet in the second one, the Glacier View one. But it occurred to me as you were talking there about the George's kind of authoritarian approach to leadership, that just prior to Neil Wilson and very much involved in the whole Glacier View was Pearson. I can't just forgotten his first name. Robert Pearson, yes. It struck me that Pearson's style of leadership was similar to George Butler's style of leadership. Did you find some parallels there, or is that just me thinking?
I have not studied the parallel per se. I know some about what is happening. I've read Gil Valentine's Canaries and Ostriches, or a book,
yes.
on that period.
Yeah,
I have read.
that's what made me kind of raise the question.
I've read the book. Yeah, there might be some parallels, but I would say perhaps the parallels are simply the fact that the way we have structured our general conference church and the way the conference functions leads naturally to have peoples in positions of leadership who can easily exercise an authoritarian way of handling situations. Our church, that could be another subject for a long conversation. I believe our church is primarily an Episcopal church. We're not Presbyterian. We don't use the word bishop, but many of our conference presidents act like bishops. And the way our church is structured is very similar to other Protestant Episcopal churches, like the Methodists in particular, very similar to the Methodists. They are an Episcopal church. Their conference presidents are called bishops, but they function basically like us, or we function like them because they were before us. And that kind of leadership leads, if you allow it, leads naturally to have authoritarian people who will make the decisions for you.
Right.
And so whether it's in the time of James White or the time of Butler or more recent times, it's the way our church functions. We have delegated to our church leaders an awful lot of authority and of allowance to take the lead and to make decisions, to prepare the agendas, to prepare the documents, to give this direction or that direction to the church, including doctrines. So I think we're living with that. That's the way we are. We love committees, but the leaders of the committees prepare the committees ahead of time.
Yes.
And the committee members basically usually just simply endorse the documents that the leaders have prepared.
Yes.
And when Butler is confronted to not act this way, he said, well, why not? Because that's the role of the General Conference President.
Yeah. It seems that the younger crowd coming through, like the Wagner and Jones and Des Ford at the time, were more desiring an egalitarian kind of hierarchy than an authoritarian.
Sure.
And like you say, and I noticed this during the no vote, there was a lot of maneuvering to, have a committee and appear like it was a vote, but the committees are kind of loaded in many ways, and they already know they're only allowing people to be delegates that they know have the same view as them. It's a fascinating structure, and I guess because Ellen White came from a Methodist background, didn't she? So I wonder if that influenced more so than James.
She did come from a Methodist background, but she's not the one who really created the church structure.
Right.
The church structure was created by James White. And James White, with a number of other friends there at the time, influential others, created a structure that was very centralized in its governance structure. And so in the early 1860s, when the constitutions were prepared, the conferences were voted into effect, the GC was voted into effect in 63, the structure itself, by being so centralized and having very few persons, men in those days, responsible for making the decisions, easily, naturally led into having a kind of Episcopal kind of church structure.
Well, that's a fascinating observation. Thank you for that. And in many ways, if that could be restructured in a different way, a lot of the problems within the Adventist Church that we see even today that have lingered on from back then could be overcome in many ways. It would give a lot more freedom for... Isn't it interesting that Ellen set up the unions in a way, or she was part of the involvement with that, to ensure that people had a diverse scope to look after the cultural issues on the ground where they were culturally, and yet she also kind of supported this authoritarian hierarchy as well with the bishops in play. But she is often that kind of contradictory person, isn't she? And we'll come back to that with 1888 in a minute. Someone, as we were writing there, you mentioned how high his temperature was. It's 40.55 degrees Celsius. So someone else
Yeah, it was
pointed out
high.
that's kind of hallucinogenic sign. She's going to
Yeah.
hallucinations at that kind of temperature.
At that temperature, yeah.
I'd love if you could just give us some of these insights that you said you've discovered from the Kellogg Butler exchange.
Oh, that's fascinating. When the fire happened of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in February of 1902, within just a few weeks, Kellogg wanted to rebuild it. But he's a man of grand ideas and grand plans and visionary. And he wanted to rebuild the sanitarium and make it a whole lot much bigger than what it was originally before the fire. And to be able to do that kind of a project, you need to have a lot of money because it would cost a lot of money. And not only would you sell shares and have people buy into, the corporation to rebuild the sanitarium, the church would also probably want to be the safekeeper of all that investment. And also, Kellogg thought that if he were to write a book and then give all the proceeds and the royalties to the building project, maybe that would facilitate that. A few years earlier, in the late 1890s, there had been a project that had been discussed that Kellogg could write a book on health principles. But it never went anywhere. The idea kind of died down. He didn't have the time to do it. But now the fire happened, and he decided to go ahead and do it. So he prepared a manuscript, a book of 600 some pages, maybe a little more than that. It's a big book called, The Living Temple. And it was basically as to how our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, but also what to do to make it function better. So principles of health, of nutrition, of good habits, of hydrotherapy, and things like this. The problem came, though, perhaps a little bit because of its theology of how the human body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And in the first chapter or two of the book, where he set up basically his theological framework of why we should take care of our human bodies, because it is the dwelling place of God, the way he explained things in the book about, if we are a living being, it is because God gives us life. And there's only one kind of life. It's the life that God gives. And it is therefore also to some extent probably God's life as well. So if we have life in us, don't we have perhaps in some ways a little part of who God is in us? And that would be the same for the animals and the plants and any living creature on earth. Well, that sounds like pantheism to some extent, and it's close to that. And the way he explained, the presence of God's life in living organisms led a lot of people to have second thoughts about what kind of theology are you advocating there. Kellogg rebutted, however, that he had given that kind of speech at camp meetings for a good 10 years. And then when he did the rounds of camp meetings to promote health and to promote the sanitariums, and there were a few of them by then, that's the kind of talks he would give at camp meetings and at pastors' meetings. So why is it that all of a sudden that what he had been saying in lectures at camp meetings, now that it is in a book, it is being branded as being pantheistic or not understanding exactly who God is and making God impersonal rather than a person, and these kinds of conversations. It became a very tense kind of conversation, and everybody, or a lot of people, accused Kellogg of being pantheist in his understanding of God. And to be fair, yes, the way he framed and said some things is easily leading to misunderstanding, a little bit of Hinduism type of understanding of may the force be with you, Star Wars fans here.
It's very new age, isn't it?
A little bit new age before its time. And so he corresponded with Butler extensively about the chapters, the couple chapters that were problematic. The two of them exchanged their ideas. He explained himself to Butler, here's what I was trying to say. And Butler said, well, you should perhaps say it this way instead, because I understand what you say to mean this. Right. And they were going back and forth in these very long letters.
Wow.
In the end, Kellogg said, okay, I get the point. He had printed 6,000 copies of the book. About 1,500 were sold. And the rest of them, he pulled them off the market.
Wow.
And he stored them by then in the basement of the old Battle Creek College building, because Battle Creek College had moved to Berrien Springs by then to become Emmanuel Missionary College. And so he pulled it off the market and he said, okay, I'm going to prepare a new edition and it's going to be called The Miracle of Life. And all of these problematic statements in the first couple of chapters, I'll remove them. And he did.
Wow.
And he replaced them with quotes from Ellen White.
Wow.
About life and how God gives life to beings and so on, and ascribing to God. So he replaced, these few pages and paragraphs with quotes from Ellen White without ascribing it to Ellen White. But the new edition never went off. It never sold. By then, he had been branded as a pantheist.
Wow.
The top church leaders had denounced him as being a pantheist, and Ellen White had said the same thing. And so it was a no-go. The book never went anywhere. And the new edition was never sold, really, not that much. In the end, in the correspondence between Kellogg and Butler, Kellogg came to believe that in spite of the best effort he did to pull off the market what was problematic, print a new edition without those problematic statements, trying to amend his ways, he basically came to think that church leaders, including Ellen White, basically just wanted him out of the way and out of the church. He says that much to Butler. And he feels like they're ganging up against him, and the pantheism is just an excuse.
Yes.
An excuse to get rid of him, so that he would not have so much influence on the church.
And does Butler affirm his fears in the letters? Does he say, "Yeah, you're right"?
To some extent, yes. Butler agrees with him, but in the end, Butler will part ways from him.
Yeah.
And will not agree with Kellogg making the decisions to pull the Battle Creek Sanitarium outside of the church's influence. It's problematic for a number of reasons. And you'll find more details in the book. And I hope more people take up the story and explore it perhaps in more details and nuance a little bit what I have written. You see, when Kellogg begins to think that the pantheistic issue is a pretext to get rid of him, he gets upset and he gets very defensive. By then, all of the other sanitariums in other parts of the states or countries have become under the purview of the local conferences or the local unions. That's the reorganization that happens in 1901, 1903. Local church entities are to be responsible for local church institutions. Instead of being parallel institutions, everybody will be under the same umbrella, and it will be the church institution. So the schools, the sanitarium, the publishing houses are merged into the church institution. Kellogg refuses to have the Battle Creek institution merged into the West Michigan Conference. He will not have it because a number of reasons. They're uneducated. They don't know anything about medical work. These church leaders are not businessmen. They don't know how to operate anything successfully. And he goes on in his rants against church leaders, and he shares all of that with Butler. And so because he refuses to allow this merger, he will pull the sanitarium away from the institution by simply one day calling a board meeting, and they had no quorum minimum in those years. And at that board meeting, they vote out of the board all of the church leaders.
Wow.
And so therefore, basically de facto, leaving only on the board of trustees of the sanitarium those who will just agree with Kellogg and just keep things as they are and never merge it with the church institution. So because of all of this happening, Butler will part ways with Kellogg. Says, you're going too far.
Yeah.
You should not do that. We could put on the board many good church leaders who understand what you're doing, who love what you're doing. You don't need to pull it under, the influence of the church. But Kellogg by then is too sour. He's too burned. He has burned his own bridges, and he doesn't trust anybody, and nobody trusts him. It's a hard conflict by the time you get to 1905, 1906. And all of that angst, emotions, and I think a revealing of the heart and the mind really happens in that correspondence between Butler and Kellogg. I think personally, George Knight does not agree with me. I think personally that Kellogg is being honest and that he's being true to himself in his correspondence with Butler. But it's possible that Kellogg is hoodwinking Butler and deceiving Butler. Everybody believes that Kellogg is basically a grandmaster at deception, and he's a liar. I have a sense that in his correspondence with Butler, I have a sense that Kellogg is honest, and that Kellogg is telling at least the truth the way he sees it. It's complicated. It's really complicated.
Yeah, but you would get a sense over, was it 100 and how many letters? 120?
150 letters between the two of them.
You'd get a sense of someone's authenticity by reading all of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
I hope I did. I hope I did right.
Yeah, I think Kellogg was a visionary. A friend of mine, Dr. Rick Ferre, who I've interviewed, has written a book on Kellogg, and just in spite of his flaws, he's quite an incredible human with an incredible vision of how things could be.
Yes.
And I think sometimes people that are incredible visionaries, I think just their clear-mindedness of what they want to do and what they can see will happen can come across as empire building and ego, when often it's just they're visionaries. They've got such a clear, if we do this, this is going to happen. I tend to agree.
And another thing that's happening at the time of Kellogg leaving the denomination and pulling away with him the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and that's really problematic, is that at the very same time, in the Southern Union, where George Butler is, we have the beginning of self-supporting institutions.
Wow.
Sanitarium and schools that are independent or in parallel to the denomination. That's in 1905, 4, 5, 6, 7. But in 1901, 1903, we had decided to no longer have that, to no longer have independent parallel institutions, that everybody would be under the umbrella of the denomination. But you see, so in the Southern Union, you've got a number of these self-supporting institutions that are beginning to arise. And they are blessed by nobody else than Ellen White,
Wow.
who supports them, who helps to raise funds for them. And that is exactly the same model that Kellogg wanted to keep for the Battle Creek Sanitarium. But they say no to him. You can't have it. And they say yes for a number of self-supporting institutions in the South, which are still existing today, by the way.
Wow.
Parallel institutions, self-supporting institutions, schools, clinics, sanitariums, they're still there.
That's evidence and demonstrates this notion that it was a political play to get him out.
He thought so. He thought so. Yeah.
Did you find the correspondence between him and Butler just suddenly ended, or was there a slow decline that you could see Butler saying, "Look, you've gone too far"?
When he begins to say you've gone too far, it's about 2 or 3 months, and that's it. It ends quite abruptly
After that,
in 1907, and Kellogg is hurt by the fact the correspondence ends.
Yeah.
The last couple letters he writes to Butler, you can tell the anxiety, but also the hurt. I think you can tell the hurt in the letter of why are you abandoning me? You know, you're the last one.
Yeah.
And again, remember, there's a family relationship there.
That's I was going to say, yeah.
Butler's son is married to Kellogg's younger sister.
Yeah. That's right. So that adds another layer of confusion because we had that clan, the Waukon clan that you mentioned, and and they were kind of at wars with the White clan, but they also
the Battle
had
Creek clan.
The Battle Creek clan, yes, and they also had, as all clans do, issues amongst themselves. But at least Kellogg and Butler, over those 150 letters, would have shared a lot of civility, kindness, and warmth. I'm sure that came through as well.
I think they did. Somebody asked in the chat here on the platform I'm on, are these letters available online?
Yes.
I'm sorry. No, they're not. They're all in the archives at the Michigan State University in Lansing, Michigan. That's where I read them. And I read only those that I could find there. I believe there are other letters, but I don't know if there are about Butler at the other Michigan University in Ann Arbor.
Yes.
But there's a huge collection of Kellogg correspondence at the State University in Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan. Yeah. And no, they're not online. They're not online.
Not online. And I know Dr. Rick Foray is going to watch this back later. He was sorry that he couldn't watch it live, but he might be able to, when he watches this later, add into the comments some extra thoughts there. One other quick thing on the Living Temple. I heard somewhere, and you can confirm this or it might be wrong, that the Desire of Ages had been out and was starting to slow down in sales, and nothing was really taking off as far as Ellen White books were, as far as, you know, the selling of it. And they kind of saw the Living Temple as, hey, this could be another real goer for the church and bring in a lot more sales and royalties, etc. Is that true? Have I heard correctly that they saw it as the kind of the next big thing? You know, the Living Temple was going to really take off like Desire of Ages had.
It could have. You see, we are in 1901 when this happens. I've got to back up here a little bit. The facts are mixed up a little bit. Desire of Ages, it's published in 1898. The fire of the Battle Creek Sanitarium is in February 1902. And Kellogg prepares the manuscript of the Living Temple later in 1902. And so the church will not publish the book per se. Because the second fire in Battle Creek happens in December of 1902, and it is the Review and Herald. they were getting ready to print the book. And that's when the fire
Living
happened.
Temple.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Right.
when the fire happened there. So,
And doesn't
was
Ellen
it
White
what-
infer that there was an angel that caused the
Yeah.
fire to destroy the books?
Yeah, to destroy books.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the 6,000 that he had printed already were
Yes.
prior to that fire.
No, they were after the fire, because the Review and Herald is no longer there. So he has it printed on his own.
Okay, right.
Yeah, by another
Right.
publisher. He takes the expense for that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And the Living Temple is still available online. I've read it.
Oh, yes, it's available. You could find a PDF copy of it. I have one. That's what I have, a PDF copy of the book.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's very interesting read.
Yeah.
So his his slightly worked version, The Miracle of Life, is that available online? Have you found that?
I think it might be as well. I think I've seen it as a PDF. Yes.
Right. And just quickly, how far apart was Waukon from Battle Creek, distance-wise?
I don't know by heart. You've got to cross the state of Illinois, and then you get into Iowa. So I would say today, by transportation today, at least 6 or 7 hours.
Right.
2 days transportation.
Wow.
So I would say, well, I don't know. Somebody could do perhaps the
maths on that.
Google
Someone
thing.
can Google and let us know. It was just a little aside there. Now,
But in those days, that's a long distance.
Yes.
That's a very long distance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone else was asking a question. I can't find it now. Somehow relating our conversation to Vatican II, and I can't find the question. I don't know if you saw it pop up. We can maybe address that another time.
A Vatican II question. Now, what does that have to do with Butler?
I know. I can't find it. I made a note to find it, and I can't. We'll move on. In the interview you did with Michael on the Adventist History podcast, and that other guy, his name just keeps escaping me. Once I've heard it 6 times.
Greg
Howell. Great guy. Really interesting questions, and obviously has done his research. I think you mentioned a missing testimony of Ellen White's that she herself tried to find, and that was somehow connected to this topic. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, in 1888, part of the conflict in 1888 with Ellen White between Uriah Smith, Butler, Morrison, and a bunch of others has to do with the interpretation of the law in Galatians. The whole conflict, the conversation about the law in Galatians among Sabbatarian Adventists begins in about 1852, 1854. So very early years of the Sabbatarian movement. And they're debating between themselves, how do we understand the law in Galatians in relationship to the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath, and the obligation to keep the Sabbath, and so on. And so they come to the conclusion of Bates' conclusion that there's a difference between the Ten Commandments and the other ceremonial laws, and that therefore the best interpretation of Galatians 3 has to do with the ceremonial law. Well, supposedly, because of the conflict that's happening there in these 1852, 53, 4 years, supposedly Ellen White has a vision, and she writes a testimony to the father, to E.J. Wagoner, Joseph Wagoner. She writes him a testimony, and to that group of people, telling them, don't talk about the law in Galatians as being the Ten Commandments. It is not. It is the ceremonial law. So we get into the 1880s now, and E.J. Wagoner resurrects the interpretation that his father had promoted in the 1850s. And Smith and Butler are saying, no, that is the wrong view. It has always been the wrong view, because in 1850 something, Ellen White had a vision. She wrote a testimony in which she confirmed that the law in Galatians is the ceremonial law. So they say, Sister White, could you pull out of your trunks or of your archives or boxes?
Yeah.
Could you pull that testimony and just settle the matter? That's what they ask.
Wow.
And so Ellen White looks for the testimony. She can't find it. For whatever reason, she can't find it. And so she responds to Smith and Butler, I have looked for it. I can't find it. But it seems to me that it was not necessarily about the whole issue of the law in Galatians. It seems to me, if I remember well, it had to do with the fact that you guys didn't get along, and you ought to get along a little better and be more patient with one another and just simply study scripture and come to your own conclusions. Well, Smith and Butler say, no, don't do that to us.
Mm,
Don't do that to us. We saw the testimony. We read the testimony.
really?
You
Right.
said it was the law in Galatians is the ceremonial law.
Wow.
And so they become very conflicted, and they begin to sense that Ellen White is wishy-washy theologically. And that is not good for the gift of prophecy in the remnant church,
No.
to have a prophet who's wishy-washy,
No.
who will change her opinion on theological issues. You can't do that.
No.
They kind of have an understanding of her inspiration as almost a verbal, a definitive type of, if she says something, that's it, period, full stop. And that's not Ellen White's perspective, of course, but it
No.
seems to be a little bit their perspective, and that's how they argue it. So that's part of the issues.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
part of the issues.
That is fascinating. And what's interesting about hearing you talk today, I'm sure after your 10 years research, there's layers and layers that go deeper and deeper. And I'm a pig in mud at the moment. I must someone give me an idea of what's a better phrase than pig in mud. The back to that lithograph, that the initial one was all about the commandments, and the second one, Christ is centered.
Yes.
Something that, and tell me if I'm wrong, but something that seems to me was an outcome of 1888 and what Ellen was defending, and Wagner and Jones, was that prior to that, the Adventist message was you can't even get a look in the door to God's righteousness, grace, etc., until you have overcome sin. Whereas 1888 put Christ at the center and said, Christ accepts you now. And with his robe of righteousness, you can be given a hand to overcome sin. And then the progressive Adventists, say later on in the Ford era, was saying, no, Christ's robe, and this is the difference with 1888 and 1980, Christ's robe of righteousness is placed on you so that when God sees you, he sees you as righteous.
Yeah.
Those three distinctions, am I roughly on the right path?
Yeah. Yes, you are. You are roughly on the right. That's right. Early Sabbatarian Adventists were legalist. Jesus forgives you sin at the moment of conversion, but after conversion, you have to obey in order to be saved. You have to keep the commandments of God and the Sabbath, particularly because of the end time eschatology theology. So yes, and this is Butler's understanding here. You've got to obey. It's important to do that. It's not only a possibility. It's an obligation. And Wagner comes on and he says, well, no, there's something else. There's Christ's righteousness that is given to us, and we can obey by his strength, but we've got to rely on him at every step of the way in order to be able to do that.
Yeah.
In time, though, Wagner's ideas, not in the early phases, but in time, his ideas will lead to undergirding last generation theology. Is that if you are really converted, if you really have the righteousness of Christ in you or on you, you will obey and you will overcome every little aspect of your life that's wrong or that you are aware of that is wrong. But not in the early years, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I may have got this wrong, but when Butler came back to a role in the church in the 90s, sorry, in the early
Early 1900s.
1900s, did you
Yep.
say he was GC president again at that time period?
No, Union president
Union president, right,
in
right.
the early 1900s.
Hundreds. And was A.G. Daniels the president at that point?
Yes,
Yeah.
he was.
See, he's another whole interesting character that would have had a
Yeah,
lot
well,
to do with that kind of Kellogg era as well.
and that's okay. Now, the facet to understand here too, you talk about clans. It is Butler who baptized Daniel's mother and kid, and Daniel's.
Wow.
It is
Wow.
Butler's evangelistic meetings in Iowa that brought the Daniels family into the church. So A.G. Daniels is basically a spiritual son of George Butler.
That is so fascinating.
Yes.
And I know here in Australia, particularly, there are some big families, some big clans, and they're very interrelated and hold a lot of power within the church. And I might be wrong, and if my mother is watching, she's on the ball with this stuff, because I was fifth generation Adventist. An urban myth maybe in the family is that my great-great-grandfather met Ellen White when she was at the Brisbane camp meetings. And it could well be true. He would have definitely
very
gone
likely.
to meetings. Yeah, he would have definitely heard her speak.
The church
And
was small in those days.
yeah, and there's another I'm not sure about this because my grandfather died sadly when my mother was only 2.5, got hit by a train, but he was a pastor, Pastor Fergus McFarlane, and he was a good Scotsman that was evangelizing and going town to town preaching and whatnot. And apparently he brought into the church the Kent family. I think I've got to double check this, but
Is that Anthony Kent?
I think they're related.
Okay.
Yeah, that whole Gary Kent, the TV evangelist over here that was with It Is Written, and now has his own independent ministry. I'm pretty sure that there's a possible thread of my grandfather bringing in the first of this big clan that eventually has to this day, the Kents, the Townends, the Kingstons, they're all related.
Okay, those are names I know.
Yeah, so I'll look into that and I'll get back to you on that. I want to do a whole program on the is it the genealogy of Adventist families.
Oh yes.
Now I want to go to the questions here quickly just to go through Summer's comments, but there were two other quick things I just wanted to say. Often people will say Ellen White was kind of nudged out of the North America and into Australia as a bit of a political move. Would Butler, Daniels, who were the players? I've heard people say the administrators, but who were the players that were involved with kind of somehow guiding her to come to Australia to get her a little bit out of the way?
Well, Butler, certainly not Butler. Butler is in Florida at the time, recuperating from his burnouts and beginning to take care of his wife that just had the stroke, because Ellen White goes to Australia August, September, November, I'm not too sure there, of 1901. So who's GC president then? It's probably Olsen that is still GC president then, if I remember my dates properly. I doubt that Olsen would very much have wanted Ellen White to leave, but there's certainly a lot of people in Battle Creek would have be happy to get rid of her.
Right. Even though originally she was part of the Battle Creek clan?
She was, but after James White dies, Ellen White moves to California. And so in 1882, there about 83, she will move to California, and that's where her residence is, then Hillsburg, California, not too far from what is today Pacific Union College, that general area of north of San Francisco.
Right.
That's where she will reside.
Right.
So she's not a resident of Battle Creek anymore.
Right. Okay. Well, that explains that. And then one last quick question that I'd been taking notes while you were talking, where I don't think you raised it today, but in the AT Sabbath school session you did, Frank Belden, and you raised his name in your presentation, but elsewhere I've heard you say that Frank Belden had a song written, was published, or a couple of songs in the Adventist hymnal. So my ears pricked
Yeah.
up when you said that.
Yes, yes, yes.
And the um, the royalties, that part of his conversation with Butler was discussing royalties and copyright and things like that. Can you
Yes.
just unpack that a little bit? Because my ears pricked up when I thought, oh, a fellow muso talking about royalties. And I was
Yeah,
fortunate enough to have, I think in 2004-ish, between 2004, 2006, one of my songs, Standing at the Cross, the GC picked up on it, and even the top leaders loved it, and they put it on the GC main website. You'd click on the site and there was a clip of my song, and they left it there
beautiful,
for several months right at the top. And
beautiful.
they negotiated some royalties with me, and it was a really amazing opportunity. So even though I've left the church, I never left because I felt there wasn't support for my music, right from grassroots right up there. Um,
Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, that my ears pricked up when you said Frank Belden. Can you just unpack a little bit more about him and that issue that he was raising with Butler?
Frank Belden is a nephew of Ellen White. He is the son of Sarah Harmon, who is the sister to Ellen
The
Harmon
twin
White.
sister.
No, they're not twin. No, no,
Oh,
Sarah.
what was the
No,
twin's
Sarah
name?
is not a twin. Sarah is older than Ellen.
Right. What was the
The,
twin's name again?
Elizabeth.
That's right. So Sarah,
And
the older sister's son.
yes,
Right.
and he is about the same age as Edson White, the son of Ellen White. He is a musician, a composer. He writes beautiful hymns and the poetry. You know, he's a composer.
Mm.
I don't know to what extent he's a musician, but he's certainly a hymn writer. That much I know about him. And then he wrote many songs, Seventh-day Adventist flavor,
Wow.
that were published in the book Christ in Song. And and then what happens is that through the years, and I don't know quite exactly all the little details of it, of how the relationship soured, but between the publishing house and Frank Belden begin to be a number of issues over royalties. Why? And Belden claims that he's not getting the amount of royalties from the Review and Herald that he should honestly be receiving from the Review and Herald. And so there's conflicts there. And he pleads with his aunt Ellen to help him sort this out with the Review. And it's again, it's complicated and it's messy. And that is the reason why he writes to Butler in 1907. Do you recall, what happened, and what is your take on this issue? And that's the letter, that the kinds of letters that are being exchanged, into which is the context of, well, what do you really think about my aunt?
Yes. 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 Oh, wow. Oh, I love this so much. So what we'll do is thanks for that. And is there a kind of a lineage still alive today of Frank Belden?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Do you know if
any.
he left eventually, or anything else about future generations of his?
Yeah, no, I don't know about future generations and how many of them would still be within the Adventist,
Yeah.
circle.
Yeah.
There are not many of the White family that are still in the circle.
Wow.
Although by now it's a lot of generations, there's about 5 or 6 generations since the time of Ellen White. So it's a little dispersed and diffused. It's hard to know exactly who's who.
Yeah. Are there any ancestors of Ellen White's that are active in the church to this day
Yes.
and travel
Yeah.
around with that
Yes.
kind of label? Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure there's many of them, but I know a couple. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So we'll go to some of the questions that are floating up here, and there are so many we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll randomly get to some. And then I want to close with one question that I've got that we can just add at the end. It's not a hard question, but it's just something I'm just interested in your thoughts on because you've gone deep into this. So we had the Arthur Klim one about that correspondence, and you mentioned it's not online. Robert Lindbeck has written Gil Valentine's The Prophet and the Presidents, has a great insight into the relationship of E.G. Butler as well.
Yeah, that's a good book. Yes.
This one here, you've mentioned elsewhere too, that about the levels of inspiration. Butler apparently wrote the 10 levels or something of inspiration. I thought that was fascinating. So David Schramm has said, so did Butler have doubts on Ellen G. White's prophetic visions? We
That's
have
a
covered
good
that, but yeah, it's a very good question to kind
That's
of.
a very good question.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a complicated question.
Mm,
I think Butler came to the conclusion that the testimonies of Ellen White were not necessarily all based upon visions, that some of them were probably based, like some of the writings of the Apostle Paul. Well, somebody from the household of Chloe has told me that. And then Paul writes a letter out of his wisdom and to the best of his knowledge how to address some of the problems that somebody from the household of Chloe told him about what's happening in Corinth. Butler came to the conclusion that probably many of the testimonies of Ellen White were written from that perspective, arising out of Ellen White's vision, not vision, but wisdom and personal knowledge, expertise, lots of years of experience and how to understand human personality, but also church and biblical issues. And he came to that conclusion, and that was part of perhaps of how it made him even more conflicted, because then he would get a letter from Ellen White, and he would have to ask himself, did she really see this,
yeah.
or is this communication coming out of her best God-given wisdom?
She seemed to single out Butler in these public testimonials. I've just was trying to find it earlier, a book of her 10 sermons that she took in 1888 at the session, the 1888 conference. It was released here in Australia and is just transcript of each of the 10 talk she did at the program, and she mentions Butler a lot in there, in a quite a disparaging way. And did she single out a lot of people like that? Was that her kind of MO or was it just Butler and a few others? Or if you look at her history of writing testimonies against people's actions, is it quite a big amount, a big resource there?
The answer is yes. She did that for Butler, and she did that for a lot of people. Yet at the same time, I think we need to understand the ethos, the culture of the time. It was not uncommon for religious leaders in those years, Adventist, Methodist, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, Presbyterians, to take upon themselves the duty, the task of calling out the sins of the people publicly, shaming people in public, denouncing people in public. That was done quite routinely. That was part of the American ethos of the middle of the 19th century and even to the later parts of the 19th century. So Ellen White, James White, and others are no different. They're doing it themselves. But the thing that's happening is that they're doing it to them as well.
Yes.
And that creates some conflict
Yeah.
there when you've got some people who will, okay, Sister White said this about me. Well, let me tell you this about her.
Yes, that was a bit back and forth.
There's a back and forth. But to be honest, though, I don't know George Butler to have ever done that about Ellen White.
No, he seems to have been
He
quite a
has not.
righteous man. Yeah,
He
virtuous
remained fair, but he remained to some extent submissive to Ellen White.
to Ellen. Yeah,
He would not understand some of her things, some of her testimonies. He would disagree with some, but he would not denounce her publicly.
yes,
He refused to do that. So
yeah,
in a way, that answers the question as well. Did he believe in her visions? Yes, he did, but he
mm,
wasn't sure when she had one.
yes, yes, yeah. He wasn't sure when the flawed Ellen stepped in and gave her opinion and
No.
used a bit of political
Yeah.
maneuvering and admonishment. But he obviously did think there were times when they were genuinely
Yes.
panoramic visions given to her. And I
Yeah.
think in listening to a lot of what you've said today and in the other podcasts I've watched, he also comes across as someone that wasn't like an egomaniac trying to get the power. He burned himself out because of the honorable things he felt he needed to do, yes, in an authoritarian kind of way, but I
Yes.
think from good motives. I think he was definitely trying to really bring about good to the church.
I think so. And
Mm.
that's the first word of my subtitle, an honest
Yes.
but misunderstood church
Good.
leader. He
Yes.
was an honest man.
Yes. Yes.
And I
that
think
comes through. Yeah.
we need to give credit to that. I
Mhm.
personally, after studying his life for close to a decade, I
Mm.
think he was a genuine, honest
Honest.
man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That comes across.
he may have been mistaken. He may have made mistakes, and he did. He
Mm.
may have been stubborn, and he was, but he was honest.
Yeah. And yes, I agree. And it's great that you're getting to kind of present that so that people aren't misunderstanding his actual intentions, and that
Yes.
places the whole story in a better light too.
Yes.
When I initially read the 1888 stuff and the book I've got here of the 10, I kind of saw him as someone that was actually political maneuverer, and so to get your perspective has really helped to shift how I see the
Yeah.
whole of 1888 and
Yeah.
what went on.
Yeah.
It's interesting you said that if you take things in context of time period, and I know George is big on this kind of thing too, George Knight, back a leader admonishing the flock.
Mm.
They'd also get up and say, now this week this family gave $50, and this week this, publicly they were kind of
Yeah.
presenting people's and
Yeah.
it's a good way to keep people in line a little bit, or to make people
Yep.
give a little bit more next month. And I'm involved with the local Chamber of Commerce, and they literally, there's a bit of a membership fee, and they literally read out every quarter, and so is behind in their membership fees. and, so I always make sure mine are up to date. um, Stephen Beagles writes, I hear you're from Andrews University. Did you know my aunt, Dr. Kathy Beagles? She was a
Yeah.
professor.
Yes, I did. I did know her. And in fact, she began to teach at the seminary when she was here at Andrews University, when I was the dean of the seminary, and I invited her to join us
Yes.
on the faculty of the seminary.
Oh, really? So
She didn't
where
stay.
is she
She
now?
didn't stay long enough.
Right. Yes. Stephen, organise an interview with me and your aunt if she's still alive. And we won't go too deep into this one, but I'm just bringing it up. Thank you, Neil, for writing. It's hard to know that Ellen G. White really understood what she understood, since she copied and pasted so much from other Christian thinkers and non-Christian thinkers. And when you showed that lithograph and James White talking about Paradise Lost, remind me of the Milton book and the whole other kind of
Oh yeah.
copying and whatnot from that book into Ellen's first vision, I think, was it?
First vision and the first rendition of the visions, spiritual gifts, but more extensively in the first 4 chapters of the volume 1 of Spirit of Prophecy, 1870. Those first 4 chapters that tell the story of the fall of Lucifer, the beginning of the rebellion, the creation, the fall of Adam and Eve, all of that is very, very similar to John Milton's Paradise Lost. With an encouragement from John Andrews, very likely, who gave her the book.
Yes. Yeah, it's a whole other topic, but just a quick...
that's a topic of its own.
We'll come back to that one another time. but I am very open to exploring that topic with context and just looking at it and not trying to be disparaging. And just coming down. Excuse me, as this I mean just a little bit still on the plagiarism, but not to drill down in any disparaging way. But I've heard this said several times. Stephen writes, if Ellen White was a plagiarist, then so was John Wesley and a few commentators from that period. And people often say, and so were the Bible writers. I don't see the borrowing that Ellen White did as the same kind of borrowing that Wesley and the Bible writers did. If you agree with that, how would you describe the distinction and the difference?
I would need to know what the difference and the distinctions are. I do know that the writers through the centuries easily borrowed from each other without giving credit. Wesley did that. Commentators in the 18th century, the century of Wesley, did that quite naturally almost. It was not seen as being dishonest, for the simple reason that for all of these people, truth belongs to God. If an author 10 years ago wrote something that I consider to be truth, I can use it because it really belongs to God,
Right.
not to that person.
Yes.
Okay, that's very different from the way we think about things today. So Wesley did that, and so on. So by the time Ellen White comes along, the practice is very well, established. James White writes a biography of William Miller. Almost 3/4 of it is borrowed, taken from another biography that somebody had written about William Miller. And so Ellen White does the same thing with many of her books. She reads good books. She finds good insights in those books. She will use those insights into her own books. And why would she do that? Because the truth belongs to God. That's it's maybe I'm oversimplifying the whole thing here, but it's a general principle. Now,
Yeah, I
of
think it's
course,
a good principle to get your head around too.
of course, in the later years of Ellen White, people are beginning to say to her, in her entourage, people around her are beginning to say to her, sister, you can't do this. In the world into which we live today, you cannot copy pages and pages and pages from another author and put your name on it. If you do that, it's dishonest. There's a question of honesty here. It's kind of lying. And so over time, by the end of the 19th century, Ellen White's way of writing books begins to change.
Right.
But it will take some time for that. And of course, I think what's happening also is that her assistants are beginning to guide her to not do that.
Yes. And I think that might have been the seed of Frank Belden's discontent too, as he's struggling with this idea of copyright and people not copying people's songs, and he's looking at his aunt.
Yeah.
And so around that time, people were starting to see it differently. It's interesting in the music world that you can't copyright chord sequences. You can't but you can copyright melodies over chord sequences. So if I write a song going G, C, G to D, anyone can do those chords. But if the melody on top of it forms a distinction between, and obviously it's two separate pieces of work, and the lyrics come into play, then that's a separate issue. You can't copy that. But you can, there's certain riffs you can't copy. So, for example, those that know what I'm talking about, the intro to Smoke on the Water by a famous group called Deep Purple, you can't copy that riff, even though it is part of a chord sequence. I'm only saying this to show how in the real world of music and copyright, there's some gray areas. And as people have kind of gotten better at understanding this, they're more careful in this approach. But when you look at, for example, blues music, the guitarist, you'll hear a chord sequence underneath, and there are pretty much only like 4 chord sequences and 5 different drum beats that every blues artist will use, but they'll speed it up a bit, slow it down a bit, and some of the words they'll shift and change, but they're quite thematic. And then between the singer and in the verses, when the guitarist comes in and does a lead solo over the top of the chords, those licks, they call them, are copied extensively by blues artists so openly. Like, there'll be the BB King lick and the Albert King lick, and guitarists will just copy it blatantly, and there's no problem with it. But music has had a kind of enough of a tumultuous kind of fighting and to and froing that people understand all that. And I feel like with Ellen White, and people misunderstand a lot of when I push back on this, I'm just trying to understand it the same way I do understand the music and copyright and borrowing and all that kind of stuff. And I think if people were willing to talk about Ellen White openly about this, they would also reach a point where you no longer needed to talk about it again, because you go, oh, okay, I get it now. But it concerns me that the people aren't and haven't been since Canwright willing to just have an open discussion about it, because I think an open discussion would lead to some understandings about copyright and how artists and creatives do use each other's material. And like you say, her secretaries started to get a feel for it and were a bit upset, but they were also trying to guide her into different waters. And I have no problem with that. I just wish the church was more open in going, yeah, let's just talk about it, because if they put it out there, I do think they'd eventually settle on an understanding that is quite usable.
Very good. Very good. Yeah.
Now, sorry for that little sidetrack there. But I often see things from a music perspective that I think helps, for me anyway. I just thought, you remember Andy Warhol, the famous artist? He also had not secretaries, but he had a factory kind of mentality with his art. So he had literally Andy Warhol's factory, where he would have himself as the main artist, and he would have a bunch of other artists there reproducing prints, lithographs, artwork that he'd said, I want a painting like this. And they would produce it, but it would go out under his name. And again, it's a very similar thing that he didn't hide it. Everyone knew, everyone talked about it. And Ellen White, I think we could benefit from a really open conversation there. Just coming. Have you seen any there that you would like to draw on? We've got so many comments.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting comments. I'll just simply skip. And honestly, also, Peter, it's getting close to be
I know your time.
Thursday morning for me.
Yeah, I'll just do a quick run through. And I so value you you having this conversation with me. There are so many comments there. Those of you that are watching from YouTube and you've written some really great questions, after the live feed finishes, do you mind going back onto YouTube and just writing them again? Because the live feed disappears on YouTube. It's very frustrating. Those that are commenting on Facebook, it stays there and makes a great conversation. So I'm just quickly seeing if there's anything there. Look, there are a heap of incredible. There's a really long one here. Look, what say we make this the last one? I'll read it and we can just have some quick thoughts on it. It's from Chad. I'm not sure too. And so once we'll read that, we'll stop and I'll have my last quick question. So I'll bring up part of it onto the screen there. A question, one aspect that I would want to ask these individuals is to understand what, based on biblical instruction, would they see falsifying Ellen G. White as being a messenger from God? Let's leave it at that one, because it is a really good question. It is on Facebook, so people can discuss that a little bit later. What are your thoughts on that? I think I do know the person that wrote to me off air about this too. It's a really interesting question. What aspect to ask yourself there, Denis, based on biblical instruction, what would you see as falsifying Ellen G. White as being a messenger from God?
I'm not sure I get the question.
Like every claim needs to have a counterclaim to it that you would go, oh, if this came to light, that would confirm that she wasn't a prophet. It's almost like saying to someone, what evidence would you need to no longer be an Adventist apologist or an Ellen G. White supporter? It looked like George Butler went to his grave still being a supporter of Ellen White, and that there was nothing that could be presented to him that would dissuade him from that. So a falsifying kind of viewpoint, what would it take to convince yourself or someone that, oh, hang on a second, from my research, I do now think she was a false prophet? They're kind of saying, what, in light of all the evidence that you use to support her, what evidence would dissuade you from that viewpoint?
I think Butler would answer it from this perspective. He would say, Ellen White was a real human being, and just like me, she was not perfect. And like any other human being, she therefore naturally could make mistakes, misunderstand some situations, and misinterpret motives and what happens. Butler knew that. Butler felt that way toward Ellen White. And so when he approached the gift of prophecy in Ellen White, on the one hand, he knew she was a fallible human being and that she could make mistakes and did make mistakes, even in her written testimonies. On the other hand, he hung on to an aspect of faith. The scriptures teach that in the remnant community of God at the end of time, there will be the gift of prophecy. This woman, Ellen White, has had a number of visions that seems to indicate that God gave her those visions. What she said proved true. What she said about this or that happened. And they had some tangible evidence, even though perhaps subjective, that affirmed their faith in the fact that she had the gift of prophecy. And so he came to the conclusion that even though she makes mistakes here, there, and everywhere in some places, nonetheless, he made a faith decision. He made a decision based on his basic faith that God was using her to guide the remnant people in his day and her day. And therefore, even though there were mistakes, even though there are misunderstandings, even though things are not perfect, God is still using an imperfect person. And even though she said things about him, shaming him publicly that he really was hurt by, he still believed God used her, even though what she did to him was not really appreciated by him and hurt him, badly hurt him, and felt that, you know, the subtitle of the book, An Honest but Misunderstood Church Leader, also applies to Ellen White.
Yes, yes.
She didn't understand him.
Yeah.
I think there's some aspects of George
Yeah.
Butler she did not understand.
Yes.
And Butler knew that.
Mm.
And Butler was hurt by that. But to his dying day, he believed in her as being a messenger of the Lord?
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you got evidence that leads you to discard and to not believe,
Yeah.
and you got some evidence that leads you to believe. You try to juggle the two,
Mm.
and as far as he's concerned, he believed in her anyway.
Yeah. And I guess Chad was saying that as you juggle these two opposing things, what one piece of evidence would tip you into not believing in Ellen White. For example, Stephen Beagles writes, if Ellen White taught that Jesus was a created being, then I would stop using her writings. Now, Stephen, I would suggest that maybe she did teach that, but so what he's saying is that there's lots of evidence for, there's evidence against, but if this one piece of evidence came up, I would believe she was false. And you're talking. I'm not even putting this onto you to answer, because you're talking about
Yeah.
George Butler, and in his whatever, he came to the end of his life, and there was no falsifying evidence that turned him off Ellen White. And I guess this person was saying, what do you think would be something that you could say? Well, there's the weight either side, but if I've discovered this in my research, I would call her a false prophet. That's where that person was going, and that's what Stephen was kind of adding there. And you might not want to answer that question. That might be for another time. Look, let's leave that there. My last question to you, and thanks again for your time. Look, it's just been amazing. And I'm talking to Dr. Denis Fortin, and his book, I'm just bringing up here on the screen. For some reason, It's gone all dark. There we go. I just bought it, and can't wait to read it. I've listened to 3 or 4 hours worth of Denis on various podcasts out there, ATTSS sessions you can find quite easily. The Adventist History podcast, which is on YouTube as well, is fascinating. And I just highly recommend people go and buy this book. It is so fascinating to truly start to understand Adventist history when you understand the players that were there leading at the time. You get a much better understanding of the big picture. So if we were looking to Adventism, and I got into a bit of trouble recently by saying Ted Wilson is a real Adventist. Some people didn't get my tongue-in-cheek nature. I'm trying to stimulate dialogue and discussion. Of course, I know that anyone who claims to be an Adventist can be a progressive Adventist, and they are a real Adventist, or whatever you want to call yourself as an Adventist. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting that at the thread of Adventism, there is a distinctive plan of salvation that, whether people know what it is or not, it is a substantially important message to kind of grasp. You can be a cultural Adventist and never think about it, and just happy Sabbath, haystacks, and enjoy music and going to church each week. Great, fine, you're a real Adventist. Or you can take the Ted Wilson view, which is a bit more traditional and in many ways the George Butler kind of Adventism, in some ways like a pre 1888 kind of view. So my question is, if we look at Adventism in these little time zones that are kind of big shifts in the teaching of Adventist doctrine, we've got 1844 to 1851. There's a real defined era there. We've got post 1851 right up to 1888, a couple of little subgroups in there, but there's a kind of a shift. Ellen thought that the Lord was coming back in 1851. She had a food worm, vision and all this sort of stuff. So things shifted after that. And I think James even stopped pushing her visions for a few years there too. Then we've got James dying post 1888, right up to the kind of the Kellogg era. There was a shift, generally speaking, in Adventist doctrine. We've got 1919 up to Questions on Doctrine in 1957. A whole big shift there, which I'll talk about with Michael Campbell next week, where there's quite a shift in Adventist perspective on righteous by faith, the gospel, etc., legalism. And then we've got the 57 to 1980 up to Des Ford, Glacier View, massive big shifts going on there. Post 1980, right up to the end of Jan Paulsen's time period, kind of some shifts in there. I'm getting somewhere with this. And then we've got from Jan Paulsen to now. People have often said Ellen White changed. She was flawed. Ideas of views. Adventism has shifted and changed and progressed into a much more biblical focus, a much more righteous by faith, grace focus. I'm not talking about the fights between Fordites and CBs and Andreasen and that kind of thing. But what is the thread that runs through from the beginning right to now that makes Adventism unique? What is the thread of a doctrine or a teaching that does run through and is a real Adventist teaching that runs through all of that time period and those key divisions of time that represented new instruction and new beliefs? What is something that is the same all the way through that people can say, yeah, I'm an Adventist because of this thing that's been there from the start and is still there right now? I've never asked that question before. That's why it's a little bit convoluted.
Okay. The importance of keeping the Sabbath because Jesus is coming soon.
Yeah, see, there's another whole podcast, keeping the Sabbath.
The observance of the Sabbath because Jesus is coming soon. That's a common thread of all of those periods you just described.
Yep. Okay. Keeping the Sabbath. Has it ebbed and flowed? That's a great thing you've said there. It is what ebbs and flows the keeping of the Sabbath as a salvation issue or not? Is that what the debate on side of this thread is the whole way through?
It could be, but that comes and goes. That ebbs and flows.
Right.
Whereas the observance of the Sabbath remains, a marker of identity of Adventism.
Yes.
How you keep it, why you keep it, should you keep it this way or that way? Is it going to be part of the seal of God at the end of time, or is it the counter to the mark of the beast? All of that's secondary. If you want, you're talking about a thread all the way through.
Yes, yeah. I'm not talking about a judgment of that thread or right or wrong or whether you agree or not. I'm just finding what the thread is.
Observance of the Sabbath because Jesus is coming soon.
And what's Ellen's role in that thread all the way through?
She confirms it. She enlivens it. She describes it. She upholds it. She augments it to some extent. But I can hold on to that thread without having Ellen White.
Yeah. Wow.
And I should be able to hold on to that thread without holding on to Ellen White.
Yeah.
I think that it's a very intriguing question you're asking, but I would say this is the essential Adventism. I would add another one. I would add a third one. I think what makes Adventism a beautiful contribution to the rest of Christianity today.
Yes.
Along with Sabbath keeping and the concept of rest, the concept of what of Sabbath really means in a society that's overworked, where people don't take breaks, don't take vacations or holidays. The concept of rest, and then the concept of Jesus is coming again. This world is temporary. This world, even though we may try our best to fix it, in the end, human solutions are not the best solutions. God's solution in the end will be the best. So Sabbath comes in that context as well. A third part of that thread, a third string to that thread.
Yes.
I would say it's the Adventist contribution to the rest of Christianity when it comes to the health message.
It's so funny, like that third one there was literally my first question I was going to ask you. What was that unique? And I forgot. So
It's the health message.
yeah.
It's not only the health message is not only about not drinking, not smoking. It's about healthy lifestyle. It's about a healthy lifestyle. It's a healthy mindset. It's a healthy physical life. It's a healthy work environment. It's a healthy community. It's a healthy environment. It's health in its broad aspects. I think we as Adventists, okay, I'm going to open a can of worms here, but I'm just going to do it anyway. I know it's late, and maybe I'm tired, but we have a contribution to make to the rest of Christianity, and we should stop denigrating any kinds of conversations we have with other Christians, because ecumenism is so bad, and it's just going to tarnish us and make us go down the slippery slope to perdition. Other Christians are waiting to hear from Adventism. What is the thread that we bring to the canvas of Christianity? What's the contribution that is the positive one that we bring, so that these other Christians can see the value in the beautiful message that we have? I say it is Sabbath rest in a world that needs God's solution, and the ultimate one is the second coming of Jesus, and that we are invited by God to live a healthy life in a healthy community. So you take care of your environment, and all these social justice issues and so on. These are beautiful threads of today's Adventist contribution to the world.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, I hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful. And I think what I think a lot of people don't grasp is that acknowledging this thread, it almost doesn't really matter why or what has brought you to those outcomes being manifested in your life. It brings about goodness.
Yes.
And
now, there might be some other beautiful things also that are constant in Adventism. I think I just saw somebody quickly here say the non-immortality of the soul. Yes, of course, that's a constant in Adventism. And there's a couple of other things as well, sanctuary message and the intercession of Jesus. It's a constant. But you're asking about the thread that really, really makes the difference. And I would say that's the thread.
And I like what you're saying there about people trying to say you can't have conversations with other Christian denominations. Trying to shut that down is what's hindering Adventist progress. James Z wrote a little earlier, I'm frustrated with lack of logic, reasoning, subjective answers, and blind loyalty to E.G. White. And I face that feeling myself, and having done 300 plus interviews, and even my first one with you could tell there was frustration in me, because
the first one, I remember that.
And I was trying to grapple with these things that I just thought were inconsistent, and that's why I'm glad you've persisted in coming back a couple of times, and we've been able to. You can see the shift in my focus. It doesn't mean I would join the church again, but my point is that I think the reason people are confused, and people have criticized me in the last couple of weeks, why are you constantly lambasting our church? It's because there has never been ongoing conversation and resolution in a safe way. It almost happened at Glacier View, where Des was given the opportunity and they were given an opportunity, and according to Bill Johnson, the consensus was reached that, hey, with this light at the end of the tunnel. Des Ford agreed with the consensus statement. they've had this opportunity to do so, but it keeps getting shut. So people
Yes.
like me who are confused, frustrated, what's this blind loyalty that James speaks of? We are never going to stop lambasting or putting a spotlight onto the church until there is the kind of discussion that is open and in some weird way, the Mormon church is doing that. You can talk to Mormon apologists, and they're quite open about Joseph Smith and the errors. And I've heard some incredible conversations with their openness, and I think that's doing them a good service. So I hope that people grasp this idea that dialogue is good.
Of
And
course it is.
just
Yes.
because we're having conflicting notions doesn't mean we're trying to deconstruct something. We're actually trying to make something more healthy.
That's
A
right.
healthy movement is open to scrutiny and the hard questions.
Yeah.
And
And you know,
Adventism
and
discovered
given who we are today in the world into which we live, you know, we have Adventists all over the world in all kinds of continents and different cultures and context. We are very different from each other. We have an educational system that has helped generations of us to think, to do critical thinking, to analyze scripture, to analyze our cultures, to analyze our religious, expressions. Of course, a variety of people like we are needs to have dialogue. We cannot all see things the same way, and I find it, I find it harmful on the part of some church leaders to want to cut down, dialogue, to not have it happen, to not have a safe place where conversations can happen about, these questions. And then in the end, if we really want to be a healthy denomination, we have to reach the point where it's okay to have a plurality of ideas and points of view.
exactly.
And that we will nonetheless, continue to work out this beautiful message we want to spread to the rest of the world. And we will do it differently and perhaps with a different undergirding understanding of it. But that's the beauty of what it is. If we are going to be a worldwide denomination, the way we are, and be a healthy one, it has to allow that kind of dynamics.
It does, yes.
Yeah.
And I think for me, my falsifying evidence I needed was, and this is just me, just my thought. I read Angela Lima wrote, I don't expect this conversation will ever happen. The GC will make sure of it. What we were talking about, this kind of dialogue. Yet
Oh.
you can only have it as a former Adventist. Looking back inside, that's what's unique about this show. And for me, I just had a moment when I was 54 that I thought what Angela just said there, it isn't ever going to happen. The way the Rubik's cube of Adventism has no moment when all the colors align and the sides are kind of facing different ways, but there's a unity through diversity. For me, when I realized that it's never going to happen, I think being an older dad and holding my little girls as I'm watching the no vote, I didn't get a sense of discouragement. I had a sense of, okay, for me, that confirms that this movement is not a movement I want to belong to. But when I talk to you, and I hope to have Gil Valentine back on the show, and I'm looking forward to Michael next week, Michael Campbell, and I loved my interview with Matthew Lucio yesterday. I see again through your eyes something that could be. And John Rosier wrote a great article, I think what Adventism could have been. And I said to him in my interview with him, or could be, so I still have something in there that goes, yeah, I see what you guys are doing. It's not for me anymore, but I can see what it could be. And I think the answer and the way forward is for this kind of conversation we're having today.
Yeah.
And hopefully because of this, other people will see, we see where this platform's coming from. And That's why this new season, I'm hoping to have as many scholars back on as possible. So if you can help me with that, have a chat to John Butler, George Knight. I'm wanting to support this notion of, hey, healthy dialogue is going to reveal this healthy thread that runs through Adventism that you speak of.
Mm-hmm. I'd love that. Yeah.
I'll just give, because James did raise this last little tangent. My apologies to Dr. Denis Fortin. I feel so lied to by the church. The excuses I hear collectively by the church, excusing their lies in history, perfectionism, it's so frustrating. And I feel that. And I guess if the current Adventist apologists and leaders and pastors realized that what James just said there is a valid claim, and part of heading towards healing and pacifying is not to find a resolution or to work how to make it work, but rather to just talk about it. And like I said with my analogy with music and copyright, it's people know it's understood because it has been talked about. Anyway, any closing thoughts, Denis? I really have enjoyed this conversation.
We've moved away from Butler.
Yes, let's bring it back to Butler.
No, that's all right. Just a concluding comment, perhaps, just to bring up here. We're all different to some extent in the church. We all have had our own different experiences. For you, Peter, when you listened to the no vote at the GC session in 2010, I think, or 2015, and that discouraged you a great deal, and that really, was a turning point for you, and that led you to request to be dropped from membership. You were not alone to feel completely disillusioned and completely blown over. I had been part of the Theology of Ordination Study Committee, that committee of 120 some people.
Yeah, wow.
We met 4 times over the period of 2 years leading to 2015. We talked, we read papers, we discussed, we voted a little bit. And it was obvious that we would not get consensus in that group. The group was split in about 3 even groups, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 who wanted to allow the divisions to make their own decisions. 1/3 who said, no way, Jose, we're not going to have ordination of women in our denomination. And then a third in the middle that said, we don't really see the biblical support for ordination of women, but we don't see it being against it either. And so maybe it's just a church policy. And if the divisions want to do it, that's probably okay. So in the end, we voted, and 2/3 were in favor of allowing the divisions, just make your own decision. And then 1/3 was, no way, we're not going to go there because that's the mark of apostasy and we're going to drop out of the, Christianity altogether. I was one of those, just like you, who saw the vote and saw how the vote was handled and how the vote was presented on the floor of the GC, completely flabbergasted by the way it was handled and by the lack of integrity when that vote was taken. And I said to myself, what in the world just happened? And myself and a number of my colleagues were terribly depressed, spiritual depression, for, I don't know, 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, a year after that vote was taken, where we asked ourselves, what in the world are we doing here? We've done our best. We're the scholars of the church. We just did, just put it all, for the effort. And in the end, okay, it didn't go that way. Well, God is bigger than my church. The gospel is better than my church. And my local community where I minister, where I have my friends, when I have trying to have an influence, is more important than what happens in a football stadium, so many miles away from where I live. In the end, It's between me and God, and it's between me and my local community, and it's between, how I help somebody else have a better relationship with Jesus. I was not happy with what happened, was very depressed about what happened, but in the end, God is bigger, and God will see us through. And so there are no denominations that are perfect. And ours is not, even though some people pretend we are, we're not. We don't have it all together. We don't have the best leadership, and we will never, because there are no human beings on earth that are perfect that will create a good leadership or the best leadership. There are some ways we interpret scripture and theology and church history. Well, that's a little weak, and it needs better dialogue and a little less confusion. So nothing is perfect on this earth. So what am I going to do with that? Well, I trust in God, and I have faith in Him that He will see us through, and that's what I hang on to. And I think that's what all of us, perhaps, in this listening dialogue here on your platform, ought to be doing. We're going to talk to each other to try to figure this out, and hopefully the future will be better for our children. Why not?
Yeah. That's a really great observation and thoughts to share there in closing. I really appreciate your time today, and I just encourage people to go and check out Dr. Denis Fortin's book, G.I. Butler, An Honest but Misunderstood Church Leader. And it's a wonderful book that will contribute to this notion of dialogue and increasing a better understanding of each other.
Yep.
And onward and upward, I say.
Thank you, Peter, for having me. I look forward to next time.
We will chat again soon. Hey, one quick thing before you go that just hit me. I interviewed Dr. Ken Samples recently, and he was the protege of Dr. Walter Martin. So Ken Samples took over from Walter Martin. I have white hair like John Ankerberg that interviewed Bill Johnson in 1984, and we're wanting to recreate that kind of show with me asking similar questions to Ankerberg, Ken asking similar questions to Walter Martin, and we need someone that's currently employed by the church to say what you've kind of said there today. I'm planting the seed. We've had a lot of interest. People have been sending me, names of people who I should interview. And
Good.
I think you'd be perfect for that. So planting a seed, don't have to answer now. You're tired. Sleep on it. But I think a recreation of the 1984 Bill Johnson, Ankerberg, and Walter Martin show would be fascinating and beneficial, because when I talked to Bill Johnson, he kind of, I think, wished he could go back and do that again and answer things differently. And this will give you an Adventist apologist the chance to answer differently. So anyway, we're getting lots of thank yous. And until next time, we'll see you again. Go and have a good sleep. And thank you.
Yeah,
again.
thank you. It's getting close to midnight for me.
See you soon, Dennis. Great to chat with you. Bye-bye.
Okay, goodbye.